The basement air down here always tastes like old carbon and dead ink. My name is Mark. Tell me, have you ever stood entirely alone in the suffocating belly of a municipal morgue at 2 in the morning, watching the heavy, greasy soot drift lazily through the beam of a single naked light bulb? Most people think working in city archives is just about dust and quiet solitude. They imagine an old librarian pushing a squeaky cart through orderly rows of oak shelves. They don't know what it's like down in the sub-basement of the Chicago Department of Records. They don't know about the incinerator. Have you ever asked yourself why paper that has been locked away in a dark room for half a century starts to smell so violently sweet when it finally begins to rot? Let me tell you. It isn't just wood pulp and aging acid. It's the faint, lingering residue of the lives that were meticulously documented upon those fragile pages, locked away and forgotten by a city that moved on without them. Tonight was my shift at the furnace. A heavy, cast-iron incinerator that burned on a relentless mix of diesel fuel and raw coal, roaring in the corner of the stone chamber like a caged beast that hadn't been fed in a decade. My job was simple, brutal, and entirely physical. Clear out the overflow archives. Take the leather-bound ledgers belonging to the unclaimed dead from the 1920s, bodies that had passed the 50-year legal threshold, and feed them straight into the fire until nothing was left but fine gray ash. My knuckles were stained black with permanent printer's ink and coal dust that had worked its way so deep into my skin it looked like old bruising. The heat radiating from the open iron door of the furnace was oppressive, baking the sweat onto my forehead and making the air ripple with distortion. I hauled a heavy wooden crate filled with damp, mold-riddled ledgers across the uneven concrete floor, my boots crunching over flakes of historical debris that had settled over decades. I picked up the first volume. The leather cover was cracked and dry, flaking off in my palms like dead scales. Gold-embossed lettering across the spine read, Chicago Department of Mortuary Records, 1920. I flipped it open, the heavy pages releasing a cloud of yellowed, choking dust that made my chest tighten instantly. The handwriting inside was dense, cramped, and scrawled in an old-fashioned iron gall ink that had turned a deep, oxidized rust color over the years. Name after name of people who died of the Spanish flu, stray bullets in back alleys, or the quiet, lonely expiration of nameless souls in cold hospital beds. None of them mattered to the city anymore. To the bureaucrats upstairs, they were just numbers on a page waiting to be erased to clear up shelf space. I grabbed a thick stack of pages from the middle of the ledger, my fingers rough and calloused, and turned toward the roaring, hungry orange glow of the furnace door. The heat hit my face like a physical wall, sinking the hairs on my arms. I raised my hand, ready to hurl the first batch into the blazing teeth of the fire. And then, right before the pages slipped from my fingers into the flames, I noticed something impossible happening on the paper. The top step of the wooden staircase felt like the edge of a sheer cliff overlooking an endless, bottomless void. My heels hovered directly over the open darkness of the basement, supported only by the terrifying, vice-like grip of those dead fingers locked firmly around the skin of my neck. Every single instinct in my body was screaming, fighting, thrashing against the inevitability of the pull, but my physical strength was nothing compared to the cold, dead momentum dragging me backward. Have you ever stood on the very edge of a high balcony or a steep mountain overlook, and experienced that sudden, bizarre, terrifying impulse in the back of your mind? The one that whispers quietly, what would happen if you just let go? Psychologists call it the call of the void. That strange, unsettling glitch in the human psyche where your brain briefly considers jumping into an abyss for no rational reason at all. People like to laugh it off, turning away from the ledge with a nervous chuckle and a racing pulse. They walk back to safety, believing it was just a passing quirk of an overactive imagination. But let me tell you what happens when that dark impulse stops being a whisper in your head and becomes a physical hand pulling you over the edge. There is no philosophical realization. There is no sudden flash of your life passing before your eyes like people always claim in cheap novels. There is only the cold, sharp reality of gravity taking over, and the terrifying knowledge that nobody is coming to save you from the dark. My right heel slipped entirely off the edge of the top step. A sharp jolt of panic shot through my spine as my weight shifted backward, and for a terrifying fraction of a second, I was suspended entirely in midair, held up solely by the frozen fingers clamped around my throat. The stinging pain across my collarbone flared as my skin tore further under the pressure of those long, yellowed fingernails. The warm blood continued to leak down my chest, soaking through my work shirt, turning cold almost instantly against the freezing, metallic air radiating up from the pit below. The glowing blue points of light hovered directly in front of my face in the absolute blackness, unblinking, unfeeling, utterly devoid of any human empathy or mercy. They were watching me drown in my own terror. And then, the creature began to descend the stairs. Not by walking. Not by climbing down like anything natural. It simply let its heavy, broken torso slide backward down the wooden incline, dragging me right along with it into the absolute depths of the cellar. Scrape, squeak, thump. My back slammed violently against the sharp edges of the wooden steps one by one. Each impact knocked the remaining breath completely out of my lungs, sending agonizing shockwaves of pain rippling up my spine and scrambling my thoughts into a chaotic, spinning blur. The smell of old damp earth, rotting fabric, and stale copper grew suffocatingly intense, filling my nose and mouth until I couldn't tell the difference between the air I was breathing and the grave dirt caked on the creature's coat. Why do we spend time worrying about the future? We plan weeks, months, lives down to the smallest detail, as if tomorrow is guaranteed like a signed contract. We worry about bills, careers, and mistakes we made years ago that nobody remembers. And then, in a quiet moment in the middle of a rainy night, the universe pulls the rug out from under your feet, and you realize how utterly meaningless those worries truly were. You aren't worried about rent anymore when a corpse drags you down a dark flight of stairs to pay a debt. We reached the bottom of the staircase with a heavy, jarring thud that rattled my teeth in my gums. The stagnant, flooded water of the basement floor rushed over my boots, soaking my socks and freezing my feet to the bone, but I barely even felt the cold anymore. My entire world had shrunk down to two things: the suffocating grip crushing my windpipe, and the pale, ghostly blue glow of those empty eye sockets staring down at me from the dark. The creature released its hold on my neck with a sudden, violent shove. I collapsed forward onto the wet gravel, gasping desperately for air, my hands clawing blindly at the muddy water as I coughed and choked, trying to force oxygen back into my burning lungs. Every muscle in my body ached. Every breath tasted like rust and dirt. I slowly pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, my arms shaking so violently they could barely support my head. I raised my eyes, blinking away the sweat and stinging blood, and looked straight ahead into the darkness of the crypt. The concrete wall I had poured earlier that night, my masterpiece, my solid, unyielding barrier, was completely blown wide open. And right inside the dark, hollow interior of the vault, illuminated by a faint, sickly blue luminescence. Something was waiting for me to crawl back inside. The silhouette detached itself from the roaring maw of the incinerator with a sound like wet charcoal snapping under a heavy boot. It did not walk across the concrete floor the way a living man walks. It glided forward in a series of jagged, stuttering jerks, its form shifting and expanding with every billow of thick, oily black smoke that poured endlessly from its chest cavity. The heat in the room spiked instantly, climbing so high that the paint on the metal storage lockers behind my back began to bubble and blister, filling the air with a sharp, chemical stench that burned the back of my throat. Have you ever stared so long into a raging bonfire that your eyes start to water, making the flames blur into distorted, monstrous shapes? You blink hard, expecting the optical illusion to vanish, only to realize the shape hasn't moved at all. It was just waiting for you to acknowledge it. Most people go through life imagining that smoke is just a mindless byproduct of destruction. We burn wood, we burn coal, we burn trash, and we watched the gray plumes drift harmlessly up into the open sky, disappearing into the vast, empty atmosphere where they can never hurt anyone again. We never stop to think about what happens to all those millions of tiny, burned particles. We never consider that smoke might actually have a memory. I pressed my shoulders harder against the blistering hot metal of the lockers, my hands splayed out flat against the riveted seams, searching desperately for a latch, a handle, anything to pull open. The heavy metal door of the sub-basement archive was locked from the outside. It was always locked during the night shift. Standard municipal protocol to keep vagrants and curious city inspectors away from the confidential records. Supervisor Miller wouldn't be down here until 6 o'clock in the morning to unlock the heavy deadbolt. 3 more hours. 3 hours in a concrete box with a roaring furnace and a shadow made of burnt history that was currently sliding across the floor toward my boots. The charred silhouette stopped about 10 feet away from where I stood pinned against the wall. It had no eyes, no mouth, and no distinct features to anchor its humanity, yet I could feel the intense, crushing weight of its gaze pressing directly against my forehead. It smelled like an old house fire that had been smothered under wet earth 50 years ago. A heavy, suffocating mixture of scorched horsehair, melted celluloid film, and ancient, rotting paper pulp. The air around it rippled with thermal distortion, making the naked light bulb overhead swing violently back and forth, casting wild, spinning shadows across the stone arches of the ceiling. Mark. The voice didn't come from the air. It didn't travel across the room through sound waves. It detonated directly inside the enclosed space of my own skull, sounding precisely like dry parchment crackling inside a hot oven. My knees wobbled, a sudden, cold wave of vertigo washing over me as the name echoed against my brain. Think about how fragile a human life really is. We spend decades building careers, buying clothes, paying taxes, and storing away memories in neat little mental boxes, convinced we are solid, permanent fixtures of the physical world. Then a single spark catches in a basement. A single page turns white in an old ledger. And suddenly you realize you are just made of fuel. Just a temporary collection of carbon and water waiting to be converted into heat and ash for someone else's records. The silhouette raised a long, jagged arm formed entirely of swirling, semi-solid soot. It pointed a blackened finger directly at the heavy iron door across the room. Not at me. At the door. And as it pointed, the heavy brass deadbolt locking the municipal archive from the outside began to turn. Slowly. With a deep, metallic grinding sound that echoed sharply against the stone walls. The key was turning on the other side. Someone was standing out in the dark hallway, inserting a key into the lock at 3 in the morning. Someone who knew exactly what was burning in the furnace tonight. The heavy brass deadbolt clicked. A sharp, metallic snap that echoed through the narrow sub-basement corridor like a pistol shot fired inside an empty drainage pipe. I didn't move. My spine was still plastered against the blistering, hot-painted surface of the storage lockers. My fingers dug so hard into the riveted seams that my nails felt like they were about to split clean off. The heavy iron door swung outward, groaning on its dry steel hinges, revealing the pitch-black hallway beyond. Have you ever walked down a basement corridor at night and felt an irrational, childish urge to turn around and run because you were entirely convinced something was standing right behind your shoulder? People always laugh at that feeling. They call it an overactive imagination, a byproduct of too many horror movies watched late at night in a safe, comfortable living room. They tell themselves that darkness is just an absence of photons. Nothing more. But let me tell you what darkness really is when you're trapped in the belly of a municipal building at 3 in the morning. Darkness isn't empty. It's crowded. It is packed tight with every single thing this city tried to throw away, forget, and burn out of existence. No one stepped through the doorway. No supervisor with a clipboard. No night watchman with a flashlight. Just an empty, damp corridor lined with flaking green paint and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed with an erratic, migraine-inducing frequency. Yet the draft blowing in from the hallway was freezing cold, a sharp, unnatural contrast to the blistering, suffocating heat radiating from the open iron mouth of the cold furnace behind me. The charred silhouette standing 10 feet away from my boots didn't turn its featureless head toward the door. It stayed completely locked onto me, its swirling, smoky chest expanding and contracting with the rhythm of a dying lung. Think about the trails we leave behind us every single day. Every time you sign your name on a tax form, swipe a time card at work, or leave a fingerprint on a subway turnstile, you are feeding the machine. You think you are living your life on your own terms. You think your choices belong to you. Then you find yourself standing in a sub-basement watching your own name write itself into a death ledger from 1920, and you realize every single step you ever took was just walking down a pre-written corridor toward an incinerator. I pushed myself away from the storage lockers, my legs feeling heavy, stiff, and hollow, like columns of wet sand. I had to move. If I stayed pinned against that wall, the heat from the furnace would bake the skin right off my bones, or the smoke man would close the distance and finish whatever was written on that blank page. I took one cautious, sliding step toward the open hallway door. My heavy work boots crunched loudly over the historical debris and scattered ash littering the concrete floor. The sound seemed to echo forever in the stone chamber. The silhouette didn't chase me. It simply dissolved into a thick, low-hanging cloud of black soot that drifted sluggishly across the floor, pooling around the open pages of the 1920 ledger lying in the dirt. I didn't look back. I bolted. I threw my entire frame forward, sprinting through the open iron doorway and plunging headfirst into the freezing, dimly lit corridor of the municipal sub-basement. The air out here tasted different. Less sulfur, more damp concrete and old sewer pipes. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered violently as I raced past them, their electrical hum rising to a piercing, high-pitched whine that threatened to split my skull open. I needed to find the main stairwell. I needed to get upstairs, out onto the Chicago streets, away from the cold dust, away from the ledgers, away from the name written in the bleeding ink. But the longer I ran down that narrow corridor, the more wrong everything felt. The hallway walls were closing in. The green paint was peeling away in long, wet strips, revealing dark, weeping stone underneath that looked suspiciously like the damp earth of a mass grave. And the sound of footsteps was following me. Not my own footsteps echoing off the concrete. Heavy, dragging boots. Marching right behind me in the dark. The sound of those dragging boots behind me did not match the steady, athletic rhythm of my own running stride. It was uneven. One footstep fell with a sharp, heavy slap against the concrete, while the other dragged along the floor with a dry, scraping slide, exactly like the movement of a man hauling a heavy sack of damp soil through a narrow drainage pipe. My breath came in ragged, burning gasps, each inhalation filling my lungs with the sharp, metallic taste of the Chicago winter, even though the air down in the sub-basement was thick and stiflingly hot. Have you ever sprinted down a long, windowless hallway when you were a child, convinced that something nameless and feral was chasing you from the dark corner behind your back? You didn't dare turn around to look. You just pumped your arms harder, pumping your legs faster, praying that if you reached the safety of the lit doorway just a fraction of a second sooner, the dark wouldn't be able to catch you. Most people grow out of that terror. They learn to rationalize the shadows, convincing themselves that monsters only exist in cheap paperbacks and late-night picture shows. They walk through the world with a comfortable, arrogant certainty that the physical boundaries of reality are absolute and unbreakable. But let me tell you what happens when you grow up and realize the monsters were never hiding in your childhood closet. They were just waiting for you to walk down the wrong municipal hallway on the night your name was entered into the ledger. I rounded a sharp 90-degree turn in the corridor, my shoulder scraping violently against the flaking green paint of the concrete wall, sending a stinging wave of pain down my arm. I expected to see the heavy steel fire door leading to the main stairwell at the end of this stretch. The door that always stayed unlocked. The door that led up to the ground floor lobby, out into the cool rain, away from the smell of burning paper and coal tar. Instead, there was nothing. The hallway didn't end in a stairwell. It ended in a solid, unyielding wall of rough, dark stone that looked as though it had been hastily sealed with gray mortar centuries before the city of Chicago was even mapped out on paper. I skidded to a halt, my heavy work boots sliding across the slick concrete floor, spraying fine grit in all directions. I slammed my palms flat against the cold, damp stone of the dead end, my fingers searching frantically for a crack, a handle, a seam, anything. Nothing. Just solid earth and weeping rock. Think about the sheer arrogance of building a city on top of a swamp. For decades, engineers and politicians poured concrete, laid steel beams, and drew straight, orderly grids over the marshlands along Lake Michigan, pretending they had conquered the terrain. They put up municipal buildings, police precincts, and record archives, stamping their authority onto the land with neat ink signatures and official seals. They never stopped to think about what was underneath the concrete. What was buried in the mud before the first brick was laid? What happens when the earth decides it wants its old tenants back? The dragging footsteps stopped right around the corner behind me. The heavy, rhythmic slide of boots on concrete ceased instantly, replaced by a deep, suffocating silence so absolute it made my ears ring with a high-pitched, metallic hum. I slowly turned around, pressing my back flat against the cold stone dead end, my chest heaving as I tried to control the frantic panic tearing at my throat. The corridor behind me was empty. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead had all blown out simultaneously, plunging the entire stretch of hallway into a pitch-black abyss where even the walls seemed to dissolve into shadow. And then, out of the darkness, a single point of light flickered to life. Not an electric bulb. A pale, sickly amber glow, casting long, writhing shadows that crawled up the damp walls like spiders. Walking slowly out of the dark, holding a heavy iron lantern that cast no real warmth, was a figure dressed in a rumpled, mud-stained municipal uniform from the 1920s. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of a broad-brimmed railway cap, but as he stopped 10 feet away from where I stood trapped against the stone, he raised his head. He didn't have eyes. Just two hollow, charred sockets glowing with the exact same orange fire roaring inside the sub-basement incinerator. "You're late for the shift, Mark," the dead man rasped, his voice sounding like dry pages tearing inside a furnace. "The 1920 ledger isn't going to burn itself." The pale, sickly amber glow of the iron lantern illuminated the intricate, flaking details of the 1920s municipal uniform. The brass buttons down the front of the heavy wool jacket were tarnished green with oxidation, etched with the old seal of the Chicago Department of Public Records before it had been rewritten or digitized. The man, or whatever occupied the empty space inside those moldering wool garments, stood completely motionless in the center of the dark, narrow corridor. Have you ever looked closely at the old identification photographs hanging on the walls of government offices or municipal basements? Those small, black and white portraits of clerks and record keepers who sat at those exact same wooden desks 50 or 100 years ago. They stare straight ahead into the camera lens with a strange, blank expression, as if they already knew their faces would eventually fade into obscurity, leaving behind nothing more than a moldy signature on a retirement form. Most people walk right past those portraits without a second glance. They assume those men and women lived out full, normal lives, retired with a gold watch, and died peacefully in their beds surrounded by grieving families. We love to comfort ourselves with the comforting lie that everyone who passes through this world leaves a permanent, meaningful footprint. We refuse to accept the darker, simpler reality. Some people are never meant to leave the basement. "I don't work for you," I said, my voice sounding thin, strained, and entirely unconvincing even to my own ears as it bounced off the damp stone walls. The man in the railway cap didn't move. He didn't laugh, he didn't blink, and he didn't shift his weight from one boot to the other. He simply raised the heavy iron lantern slightly higher, the flickering amber flame inside casting long, distorted shadows of his emaciated fingers against the weeping concrete. The smell radiating from him was suffocatingly intense. It wasn't just coal dust or old paper anymore. It was the heavy, unmistakable stench of river mud, stagnant swamp water, and scorched leather that had been sealed away beneath the city streets for over half a century. "Everyone down here works the shift, Mark," the dead man replied, his voice sounding like dry leaves being crushed beneath a heavy iron boot. "Some people just don't realize it until the last page turns white. Think about how much of your life is actually spent waiting for an ending you didn't choose. You wake up, you punch the clock, you shuffle papers, you burn what other people tell you to burn, convinced that you are an independent agent steering your own ship through the storm. Then one night, the corridor ends in a solid stone wall. The lights go out. And you realize the uniform you've been wearing all along wasn't yours to begin with. It was just left hanging on the back of the door by the last guy, waiting for someone new to fill the empty sleeves." The dead man took one slow, deliberate step forward. His heavy work boot made a wet, sucking sound against the concrete floor, as if he were walking through ankle-deep marshland rather than a municipal sub-basement. I pressed my spine harder against the solid rock dead end behind me, my hands clawing instinctively at the rough stone, searching for any possible exit, any crack in reality that would let me escape this nightmare. There was nothing. The corridor behind him was completely black, choked with that thick, oily smoke that had drifted all the way from the incinerator room at the other end of the building. The heat was rising again. Even down this dead-end stretch of the sub-basement, the air was turning blistering hot, baking the moisture from my skin and making it difficult to pull a clean breath into my lungs. "The ledger is waiting," the dead man said, extending his free hand toward me. His fingers were long, stiff, and stained a permanent, dark indigo with old printer's ink, exactly like my own hands. "The 1920 volume isn't finished yet. Page 58 still needs your signature." I stared at his outstretched hand, my chest heaving, every single muscle in my body trembling with a violent, adrenaline-fueled terror. I knew what was on page 58. My own name. Written in bleeding, oxidized ink, right above the word incineration. And as the dead man took another step closer, raising the iron lantern to illuminate the dark, weeping walls, the sound of the roaring coal furnace began to echo down the empty corridor once again, growing louder, hotter, and closer with every passing second. The heat rolling down the narrow corridor was no longer just ambient warmth. It had grown heavy, oppressive, and blistering, baking the moisture straight out of the air until every breath felt like inhaling dry, scorched dust from a kiln. The dead man in the 1920s railway uniform stood just a few feet away, holding the iron lantern steady while the amber flame inside flickered with an unnatural, violent intensity. Have you ever stopped to consider how easily a life can be summarized into a single piece of official documentation? We spend decades accumulating experiences, learning lessons, loving people, and building complex memories that feel entirely unique and irreplaceable to us. We walk around with our heads held high, convinced of our own profound individuality. Then we die, or we disappear down into the municipal archives, and some tired clerk with ink-stained fingers opens a ledger, flips to a random page, and reduces your entire existence to 3 lines of cramped handwriting. Name. Cause of death. Date of disposal. That is all you ever amounted to in the eyes of the city. A statistic filed away in a dusty drawer until someone like me comes along to feed the furnace. "I'm not signing anything," I said, my voice cracking sharply as I forced the words past my dry, burning throat. The dead man did not lower his hand. He didn't blink those hollow, glowing sockets that burned with the exact same amber fire roaring inside the sub-basement incinerator at the far end of the hall. Instead, a slow, stiff distortion pulled at the corners of his gray, parchment-thin lips, not quite a smile, but the cruel recognition of an inevitability that had played out 1,000 times before in this very corridor. "You already did, Mark," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry pages scraping together inside a hot oven. "The moment you picked up the first shovel of coal on your very first night down here, your hand was already moving the pen. Think about the choices that led you to where you are right now. Every job you took when you needed the money, every dark room you agreed to work in because nobody else was watching, every dark corner you ignored. You told yourself you were just putting in your hours. You told yourself it was temporary. You never stopped to think that every shift you worked was actually an apprenticeship for something much darker, much older, and much more permanent. We are all just apprentices to the ledger." From somewhere deep within the folds of his moldering wool coat, the dead man produced a heavy, leather-bound volume. It wasn't the 1920 ledger I had dropped back in the archive room. This one was newer. The leather spine was dark, smooth, and damp, smelling faintly of fresh printer's ink and the sharp, chemical tang of municipal record storage. He held it out toward me, resting the heavy book flat upon his open palm. I looked down. The thick cover bore no title, no gold-embossed lettering, and no department seal. Just a blank expanse of black leather that seemed to absorb the amber light of the lantern entirely, casting a cold, dead shadow across his wrist. "Page 58, the dead man whispered, his voice vibrating directly against my skull like a telegraph wire humming in a winter storm. "Open it." My hands were shaking so violently that my fingers felt completely numb, stripped of all strength and coordination. The heat behind us was building, roaring louder now as the coal-fired incinerator at the end of the corridor seemed to stretch its reach through the stone walls, boiling the paint off the ceiling and filling the air with thick, oily black smoke. I didn't want to touch the book. I wanted to scream, to punch through the solid stone wall behind me, to run back into the dark and fight the smoke man with my bare fists. But my arms moved on their own. It wasn't my will driving them anymore. It was the heavy, gravitational pull of the page waiting for its final entry. My right hand rose slowly, trembling against the blistering heat, and my fingers brushed against the cool, damp edge of the black leather cover. The moment my fingertips brushed against the damp, cold surface of the black leather cover, a sharp, electric jolt shot straight up my arm, making every single muscle in my body lock rigid with an instantaneous, paralyzing shock. It did not feel like touching an ordinary book bound in cured hide and glue. It felt precisely like pressing your bare hand against a sheet of raw, uninsulated copper wire carrying 10,000 volts of direct current straight from a municipal generator. Have you ever touched a dead body shortly after the heart has stopped pumping? People always talk about how cold a corpse feels, as if death were simply a matter of the room temperature dropping a few degrees. That is not the real horror of it. The true, stomach-churning horror of touching the dead is the absolute, unnerving absence of friction. The skin feels too smooth, too flat, too entirely disconnected from anything that ever possessed a pulse or a drop of warm blood. It feels like touching a wax replica of a human being that was left out in the rain too long until all the life was washed completely out of the clay. "Open it," the dead man repeated, his voice dropping an octave, resonating like a heavy iron bell struck in an empty vault. The amber flame inside the iron lantern he held flared violently, turning a brilliant, blinding shade of violet that cast long, claw-like shadows across the weeping stone walls of the dead-end corridor. The heat behind us was no longer just baking the air, it was pressing against my back like a physical wall of solid flame, scorching the fabric of my work shirt and sinking the hairs on the back of my neck. I couldn't pull my hand away. My fingers were magnetically fused to the damp black leather, locked in place by some unseen, terrifying pressure that defied every law of anatomy and physics. My right hand rose, trembling so hard the bones felt as though they were rattling loose inside my skin, and gripped the front cover of the ledger. With a slow, agonizingly loud rip, like dry adhesive tearing away from rusted metal, the heavy cover lifted. Think about the secrets you have kept hidden away in the deepest, darkest corners of your mind. The mistakes you made when nobody was watching, the promises you broke when it became convenient, the people you walked away from because saving yourself was easier than saving them. You spend your entire life locking those memories away in a mental vault, convincing yourself that if you don't look at them, they stop existing. You think your past is a private book that only you have the right to read. Then you stand in a sub-basement with a dead man at 3 in the morning, and you realize the ledger has been keeping score of every single breath you ever wasted. The pages inside the black book did not turn like normal paper. They flipped themselves over with a frantic, rushing snap, turning faster and faster in a blur of gray pulp and dark, smeared ink until the entire volume trembled violently in the dead man's palm. Snap, 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 snap. Dozens of pages. Hundreds of pages. 50 years of municipal unclaimed deaths, unrecorded disappearances, and forgotten shifts. Suddenly, the frantic motion stopped. The pages locked dead open right in the middle of the heavy volume. Page 58. I forced my burning, bloodshot eyes to look down at the open expanse of paper illuminated by the violet lantern light. There were no other names on the page. No long lists of dockworkers, no stray vagrants, no victims of the river. Just a single line of handwriting written in that exact same frantic, oxidized iron gall ink that I had watched bleed out of the 1920 ledger upstairs. My name. And directly beneath it, a blank space the exact size of a human thumbprint, waiting for a seal. Your shift is almost over, Mark, the dead man whispered, leaning closer until the smell of river mud and scorched horsehair filled my lungs entirely. Just press your thumb to the ink. And the record will be complete. The space on page 58 was not merely empty paper waiting for a mark. It was a depression in the fiber, a thin, shallow groove pressed into the center of the heavy page that looked precisely like the impression left by a heavy iron seal pushed into cooling red wax. My thumb hovered inches above the dark, glistening smear of oxidized iron gall ink shining in the violet glare of the lantern. Have you ever pressed your finger against something when you knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that doing so meant you could never take it back? Like signing a confession for a crime you didn't commit just to make the interrogation stop, or stepping off the edge of a high cliff because you were too exhausted to fight the gravity pulling you down. Most people go through life believing they always have a choice. They think freedom is a permanent state of being, a wide-open highway where you can turn the steering wheel at any moment and drive off in a completely different direction. They refuse to accept that every small, insignificant decision we make is actually just laying down another brick in a tunnel that only leads to one place. I won't do it, I breathed, my voice trembling so hard the words fractured into dry, raspy coughs that tasted of coal dust and copper. The dead man in the railway cap did not move an inch. The pale, hollow sockets of his face remained fixed upon me, burning with that steady, merciless amber glow that drew its fuel straight from the roaring incinerator at the end of the corridor. He didn't try to force my hand down. He didn't threaten me with violence or scream in anger. He simply waited with the infinite, crushing patience of a man who had been standing in this damp sub-basement for 50 years, watching living men break themselves against the weight of the municipal records. You don't have to choose, Mark, he whispered, his voice vibrating directly against the bones of my skull like a telegraph key clicking in an empty room. The book was written before you were even born. You are just signing your own name to the bottom of a page that dried a long time ago. Think about how much of your life is actually dictated by things you had zero control over. The city you were born in, the family name you inherited, the damp basement room you ended up working in because the rent was cheap and the hours matched your loneliness. We walk around acting like independent authors, clutching our little pens and writing our stories out on clean sheets of paper. Then the ink starts bleeding. Then the pages start turning themselves. And you look down to realize your entire existence was just an overdue book that the city was waiting to return to the fire. My right hand began to descend. It wasn't my brain sending the signal. It was the heavy, downward gravity of the ledger itself, pulling my arm like an iron weight attached to a winch. My thumb inched closer and closer to the wet, dark smear of ink waiting in the center of page 58. The heat behind us surged again. A massive, deafening roar echoed down the narrow corridor as the coal-fired incinerator at the far end blew its iron doors wide open on their own, belching a tidal wave of thick, oily black smoke and violent purple flames straight toward us. The smoke man was back. He wasn't 10 feet away anymore. He was riding the crest of the black plume, gliding down the hallway at terrifying speed, his featureless, charred silhouette stretching out long, jagged arms to block the only path left behind us. We were completely trapped between the dead man with the ledger and the burning beast of the furnace. My thumb touched the ink. It didn't feel cold. It didn't feel wet. It felt boiling hot, like pressing bare skin against a freshly welded seam of structural steel. A sharp, blinding flash of white light exploded behind my eyes, drowning out the corridor, the dead man, the lantern, and the roaring fire, leaving behind only the sound of a heavy iron door slamming shut from the outside. The white flash behind my eyes did not burn out. It settled. It compressed itself into a blinding, relentless glare that seemed to strip away the walls of the sub-basement corridor, the municipal archives, and the city of Chicago entirely, leaving nothing behind except a vast, infinite expanse of stark, unyielding white paper. My thumb remained pressed flat against the damp, boiling center of page 58. Have you ever experienced that strange, disorienting moment right before you wake up from a deep, suffocating nightmare, where you know you are asleep, yet you cannot force your eyes to open? You struggle against the dead weight of your own limbs, screaming silently inside your head, praying for the morning light to break through the window and shatter the terror. Most people trust that waking up is guaranteed. They believe reality is a safe harbor they can always return to once the dream gets too dark to bear. They never consider the possibility that the dream might be the only real thing left, and that the waking world was just a temporary story you told yourself to keep from going mad in the dark. The pain in my thumb began to spread. It wasn't a sharp, stinging cut from a paper edge or a simple thermal burn from a stray coal. It was an internal, systemic erosion, a deep, chemical change spreading outward from the point of contact, racing up my wrist, flooding my veins, and replacing my warm blood with that thick, oxidized iron gall ink. I tried to pull my hand back, but my fingers were no longer my own. They had stiffened, darkened, and lost all their living flexibility, turning the exact same gray, fibrous shade as the heavy ledger pages fluttering wildly around my head. Think about how fiercely we protect our identities while we are alive. We guard our names, our reputations, our credit scores, and our little personal histories as if they were sacred relics bestowed upon us by the gods. We fight tooth and nail to make sure people remember who we were, what we achieved, and where we walked. Then you stand in a room where the ink is alive, and you realize that a name is nothing more than a temporary label slapped onto a container of fuel. Once the fuel is burned, the label goes into the fire with it. The roar of the incinerator had grown deafening. It was no longer echoing from the end of a distant hallway, it was vibrating directly inside the marrow of my bones. The smoke man had closed the distance completely. I couldn't see him anymore, the blinding white light and the dense, oily black smoke had merged into a swirling vortex of total occlusion, but I could feel his massive, charred hand resting heavily upon my right shoulder. It felt like a slab of cooling cast iron settling onto my back. "The entry is complete, Mark," a voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't the dead man with the lantern speaking now. It was the furnace itself. The voice of the sub-basement. The voice of every unclaimed soul whose ashes had been scattered down these municipal drains since the city was first founded on the marsh. The heavy black leather ledger snapped shut beneath my hand with a sharp, echoing crack that sounded like a gunshot inside an empty vault. The white light vanished instantly. The stark emptiness dissolved. And I found myself standing once again in the freezing, dimly lit chamber of the municipal sub-basement, staring directly into the open, roaring mouth of the cast-iron incinerator. The open mouth of the cast-iron incinerator was not glowing with ordinary orange flames anymore. The heat radiating from within the heavy iron box had turned the air into a shimmering, distorted wall of thermal energy that smelled intensely of scorched coal tar, sulfur, and wet, decaying paper pulp. My right hand was still locked in place, resting flat against the heavy black leather of the ledger that now lay wedged upon the metal lip of the furnace door. Have you ever looked closely at the glowing embers inside a wood stove late at night, watching how the red-hot coals slowly crumble and collapse into fine, gray powder? You think about how much energy, how much heat, and how much fierce, crackling life it took to turn a solid piece of hardwood into a handful of worthless dust. People look at destruction as an ending. We mourn the things that burn down, the buildings that collapse, the records that get lost to the ash. We assume that once fire touches an object, its story is finished forever. We never stop to consider that burning might actually be the moment a story finally achieves its permanent form. I tried to pull my right hand back from the ledger, but my fingers refused to obey the commands of my brain. The skin across my knuckles had turned a pale, parchment-like gray, the fine lines of my fingerprints blurring and dissolving into the dark, oxidized iron gall ink that had soaked straight through my skin during the signature. I wasn't bleeding red anymore. Every time my heart pulsed against my ribs, it pumped a thick, dark stream of liquid ink up my arm, staining the cuffs of my work shirt with permanent black streaks. The dead man in the 1920s railway uniform was gone. The corridor behind me was empty, pitch black, and silent, save for the low, rhythmic mechanical breathing of the diesel burners feeding the beast in the corner of the room. And from inside the roaring depths of the furnace, the charred silhouette, the smoke man without a face, reached out of the flames. Think about how terrifying it is to realize that you are completely disposable in the grand machinery of the world. You spend your entire life working, sweating, paying bills, and stressing over trivial deadlines, convinced that your existence holds some grand, irreplaceable value to the universe. Then you end up on a night shift in a municipal sub-basement. You watch your name bleed onto a page from 50 years ago. And you realize the world didn't need you to live, it only needed you to feed the fire when your page came up in the rotation. The charred hand of the smoke man grasped my left shoulder. The grip was heavy, cold, and absolute, possessing the unyielding weight of a structural steel beam settling into a concrete foundation. It didn't pull me with brute, panicked force. It guided me forward with the calm, methodical precision of an archivist placing a finished volume back onto its designated shelf. My heavy work boots slid across the rough, soot-covered concrete floor. 1 step. 2 steps. Until the tips of my boots touched the open metal lip of the incinerator door, directly over the roaring, violet-tinged bed of burning coal. Look down at your own hands right now. Look at the lines on your palms, the skin stretched across your knuckles, the fingernails trimmed clean. How long do you think those hands will remain attached to a living pulse? How many years before someone else takes your place in whatever room you're sitting in right now, wiping down your desk, throwing away your old notebooks, and clearing out your drawers for the next guy in line? We are all just temporary ink on a temporary page. And sooner or later, the shift supervisor comes down the hall with a key, the door opens, and the furnace demands its fuel. The smoke man leaned in close to my ear, his breath smelling of 50-year-old ash and damp municipal archives. "Time to close the book, Mark," he whispered. And with a single, effortless shove, he sent me tumbling headfirst into the fire. The heat didn't burn my skin the moment I fell forward. It welcomed me. It wrapped around my limbs like a heavy, suffocating blanket woven from 1,000 pages of burning parchment, pulling me deeper and deeper into the blazing, violet-tinted heart of the cast-iron incinerator. My body didn't scream. There was no sudden, frantic surge of pain as the flames rushed up to meet my chest, because by then, the blood in my veins had already turned completely to ink. Have you ever watched a thick, heavy volume slowly consumed by an open fire? The paper curls at the edges first, turning a brittle, fragile brown before the bright orange teeth of the flame catch the dry wood pulp. The ink on the pages flares up for a brief, blinding second, bright and dark all at once, before the words dissolve, the structure collapses, and everything is reduced to a soft, weightless drift of gray ash. People always think that is where the story ends. They sweep up the fireplace, empty the ash pan into a metal bucket, and throw the remains away in the municipal dumpster, believing that once the fire goes out, nothing is left behind. They are so terribly, beautifully wrong. The fall inside the furnace did not lead to a pile of burning coal. Instead, I landed softly on a vast, endless floor composed entirely of stacked, leather-bound municipal ledgers stretching out into a pitch-black horizon in every single direction. The air here was completely still. No smoke. No sulfur. No roaring diesel burners. Just an overwhelming, absolute silence that hummed softly against my eardrums like a telegraph wire waiting for a message that would never arrive. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, my fingers pressing against the cracked, dry leather of a ledger marked Chicago, 1902. My hands were no longer made of flesh and bone. They were smooth, black, and translucent, shining faintly in the dim amber light, perfectly formed out of dried printer's ink and compressed paper fibers. Think about the sheer arrogance of the living. You walk around the streets upstairs, breathing the clean rain, checking your wristwatches, planning out your weekends, and believing you are the sole authors of your own destinies. You lock your doors at night, write your little diaries, sign your names on dotted lines, and convince yourselves that your history belongs exclusively to you. You never stop to look down at the grates in the pavement. You never wonder who is down here in the dark, keeping the fires burning, sorting through the overflow, and making sure the ledgers balance out at the end of every shift. A heavy set of footsteps echoed softly across the endless floor of books behind me. Slow. Deliberate. Accompanied by the dry, scraping drag of a heavy work boot on leather spines. I didn't need to turn around to know who was walking out of the dark. I could hear the tarnished brass buttons of the 1920s railway uniform chiming softly together with every step. You did a good job with the 1920 volume, Mark, a quiet, gravelly voice rasped over my shoulder. A pale, ink-stained hand reached down and placed a heavy, blank black leather ledger right on the floor directly in front of my knees. Beside it lay a pen carved from a charred piece of wood, its tip dripping with fresh, dark, oxidized ink. Look down at your own hands right now, while you still have the luxury of feeling the warm pulse beneath your skin. Look at the desk you're sitting at, the room around you, the door leading out into the hallway. Enjoy the quiet. Enjoy the illusion of choice. Because sooner or later, your shift will end too. The supervisor will unlock the heavy iron door, the furnace will call your name, and you will finally understand why the fire never goes out. I picked up the wooden pen, pulled the black ledger closer to my chest, and opened the cover to page 1. The shift was just beginning.